Hanukkah. You know, it's one of those minor festivals that has become a major festival. You know, it's a funny thing about Hanukkah. Rabbis hate Hanukkah for the most part because, probably because Jews think it's so important. So what we tend to do is if Jews think it's important, we don't, and what Jews don't think it's important, don't think is important, we think is very important and beat them up. No, that's not so nice. I'm just joking around. But really, it is interesting that Hanukkah is a minor festival that became a major festival here in this country. And there's so many interesting insights about Hanukkah. The first is just that. You know, we tend to say, oh, it's only because it's Christmas, it's because it's Christmas. But if you think about it for a second, that's a very funny thing to say. If you really wanted to assimilate into a culture, the best time to assimilate into a culture, if that was your genuine desire, the best time to assimilate into the culture is to actually celebrate their majority festival. If you really didn't want to assimilate into a country, one of the finest ways to assure that no matter what, your neighbor will know you're different is exactly the time when everyone in your neighborhood celebrates the same holiday, you celebrate a different holiday. So it turns out that the fact that over about 80% of American Jews light a Hanukkah menorah. And I'm not saying they light it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or that they light it exactly at sunset. I'm not asking how they light it. The fact that 80% of American Jews score out as lighting a Hanukkah menorah means that the vast majority of Jews in this country want to be Jewish. And at the moment when it would be easiest to kind of hang back and be part of the dominant general culture, if they really wanted to assimilate, that's when they say, nah, I think I'll celebrate my own holiday. It may be very different from everyone else in this country. So I think we should hold off on all demographic studies that measure Jews as assimilated for the next 50 years and imagine that as long as 80% of Jews are observing Hanukkah, most Jews actually want to be Jewish. And rather than millions of dollars for demographic studies to prove that most Jews don't want to be Jewish, why don't we spend the millions of dollars on demographic studies on simply offering Jews wisdom that makes a difference in their lives? So that would be message one on Hanukkah. It turns out that Hanukkah is one of the most sophisticated festivals in the calendar. Everybody knows the one story about Hanukkah. By the way, that's a story of Hanukkah that comes from the Talmud. It's the story of the one cruse of oil that was discovered. And that one cruse of oil it was only supposed to last for one day, but it lasted for 8 days. And that story, just so we know, Hanukkah happens, literally the story of the victory of the Maccabees, happens in the 160s before the Common Era. The first time we ever hear that story is in the 4th century of the Common Era. In other words, 450 years after, quotation marks, the Hanukkah story is the first time we hear the tale that we know. So there are a lot of different stories of Hanukkah. And I like to offer this about Hanukkah. First of all, I love the miracle story. But I love the miracle story specifically because it's a miracle story. And what you have to ask about that story, if you really want to learn what it's about, is you have to ask this: what are the chances of one bit of oil? If you did this experiment at home, let's say you did this experiment at home, we're going to do chemistry, and you take a little oil, and you did it, and you put it in your menorah. Do you think how many times you would have to do it before, by golly, or oh my God, it's lasted a full 8 days? Well, of course, we all know you could do it infinite number of times, and a little bit of oil will never last 8 days. Now, since the story is told 400 years after, obviously it's a story. Since they weren't stupid, those people, the rabbis definitely weren't stupid, they knew if you did it 1,000,000 times, an infinite number of times, it would not last. So what were they saying? Well, it turns out it's a profound story about the Jewish people in general and individual human hope in particular. It turns out that the oil is a metaphor. The oil is a metaphor for the Jewish people. And ask yourself this. We've been around knocking around the planet, the Jewish people, for 3,500 years. Really, really honestly, what do you think the chances are that this little, relatively insignificant, always small, always on the run minority, what do you think the chances of this little group lasting this long? Almost nothing, right? Well, that's the point. The miracle of the oil that we tell is actually a story of the Jewish people. It has nothing, the oil is a metaphor. And what we really need to do when we light candles is to take a deep breath and say, wow, really, think about it. This little people is still here? It's a miracle. I'm grateful. Now, it turns out what's true about the Jewish people is also true from an internal human perspective. All of us have had experiences where we have been so depleted as human beings, that we have been so beaten down, that's all that's left is a little bit of light inside of us, and we get scared. It's going to be squelched. Maybe it's, God forbid, somebody had cancer in our family and died and left us alone, or maybe we lost our job, or maybe we ourselves are very, very ill, or we have tremendous problems on our relationships. Maybe, God forbid, a child something happened to, and we feel like we're in the dark of night, and we feel there's just nothing inside of us. There are no resources, no energy to even get up in the morning. And it's so sad. And there's a kind of despair that sets in. It's kind of like, the way the sun, by now in the year, the sun's setting at 4:10. If you didn't know better, you'd think tomorrow it'll be 3 o'clock and 2 o'clock, and eventually there'll be no sun forever. And what's true in nature is true in our own inner life. And then comes this holiday. And the very first day of the holiday, on the darkest day of the year, which is a metaphor for when we feel darkness inside, is you light one little candle. And that's all that's left sometimes, that little bit of light inside of us. But here's the wild, most amazing, if you're religious, spiritual, if you're not, psychologically interesting, aspect of the human being. With just one little bit of life, with just a little light, a breath of life, it's amazing. Fanned, that one light, nurtured, that one light, cared for and tended, that one light can grow. It can become 2 lights and 3 lights and 4 lights. And haven't we seen that on the planet? A person can wind up having, God forbid, a child killed in an accident with a drunken driver, and that person winds up finding a way from the devastation to light so many lights that she founds an organization against drunken driving. Or the person who loses a child to cancer and turns out to, this is a person I know who turns out to build, after 5 years, raises the money to build a pediatric wing, a cancer pediatric wing in a city that never had that in this country. And you wonder, how do people do that? That's the Hanukkah story. From one little light to a second to a third. And the reason it's 8 is because actually it's a mystical number of 7 plus 1. When I say 7, if you have a kind of Jewish biblical ear, you immediately think 7, the creation of the world. It's a whole world. 7 plus 1. It's a world plus. One little light inside of a human being could actually wind up transforming the world itself.